Fantastic. So I will end the poll now. Great stuff. So just over 50% from Kerry, and we have people in Munster, Leinster, Connacht and Ulster as well. So welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. And the majority of people have either attended a webinar or one of our previous webinars or have already heard of the Kerry Biosphere Reserve. So that's good to know as well. So I hope I don't bore you getting started. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the Kerry Biosphere Reserve is, where it is, and what having a biosphere reserve means. And then later we'll be joined by Mary Sheehan, who is one of the park rangers working in Killarney National Park, and she's going to focus in on the habitats and species in the Killarney National Park. So to start off with, my name is Eleanor Turner, and I am the recently appointed Biosphere Officer working with South Kerry Development Partnership on the Kerry UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. And this whole programme of events has been sponsored or funded by the Creative Ireland programme and Kerry County Council and the EPA through their event support scheme. So thank you very much to the funders. So just to go through the basics at the start, what is a biosphere reserve? Well, a biosphere reserve is an area that has a focus on nature conservation, but it's not just about nature conservation. It's also about how people interact with nature in that area and how we can live sustainably within the environment that we exist in. So it's about how people make their livelihoods, how they run their businesses, and how we can incorporate recreation within those protected areas or outside of them that support the sustainable development and nature conservation within those areas. So we like to say they're places where nature and culture connect. So the UNESCO, it's obviously UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. So UNESCO stands for United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization. So UNESCO programs contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So as I mentioned before, the Biosphere Reserve program is heavily focused on sustainable use of the landscape, sustainable development. So the first Biosphere Reserve was designated in 1976. And the Kerry Biosphere Reserve was actually first designated as the Killarney National Park Biosphere Reserve in 1982. And in 2017, it underwent a review process and was expanded. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later. So worldwide, there's a whole network of biosphere reserves, and they cover over 6.8 million kilometers squared, over 129 countries. And there are approximately 257 million people living in a biosphere reserve worldwide. The Man in the Biosphere program is an intergovernmental scientific program that aims to establish a scientific basis for enhancing the relationship between people and their environments. And their vision is a world where people are conscious of their common future and their interactions with the planet and act collectively and responsibly to build thriving societies in harmony with the biosphere. So there's three main functions of a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. The first is nature conservation, as we've mentioned before. The second, sustainable development of the area. So there we're looking at how businesses can operate sustainably within their environment. And the third aspect is research and learning. So there's obviously a lot of scientific research that goes in, particularly within the areas of Killarney National Park, on the habitats and species that exist there. These three aims are all carried out within the three zones of a biosphere reserve. So this is a simple graphic that we've taken off the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve website. And you can see the center green area there is the core area. Then around that we have the darker blue zone called the buffer zone, and on the outside the transition area. So the core area is a strictly protected zone, and that contributes to the conservation of landscapes, ecosystems, species and genetic variation. The buffer zone that surrounds or adjoins the core area is used for activities that are compatible with sound ecological practices that can reinforce scientific research, monitoring, training and education. And then the transition area, which is the light blue one around the outside, is where communities foster socio-culturally and ecologically sustainable economic human activities. So worldwide, there's 714 UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, and these are added to all the time. So that number is continuing to rise. In Ireland, however, we only have two at the moment. So we have the Dublin Bay Biosphere Reserve over on the East Coast, and that was initially designated in 1981 as the Bull Island Biosphere Reserve, and then extended in 2015, along with the name change to become the Dublin Bay Biosphere Reserve. And then we have the Kerry Reserve down here. And as I said before, first designated in 1982 as the Killarney National Park and then expanded in 2017. So where exactly is it? Loosely put, it's around the centre of County Kerry here. It incorporates Killarney National Park, so the lakes of Killarney, some of the McGillicuddy Reeks, and over into the Paps region on the eastern side of the county. Now here's a closer map of the Kerry UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, and it shows you the few different zones, the 3 different zones that we're working with. So you can see the red zone in the centre is the core zone, and that is what we're going to be focusing on this evening. So Mary's going to be talking about the habitats that exist within the Killarney National Park that are on the designated species or habitats list. The buffer zone is the browner area, so it incorporates parts of the McGillicuddy Reeks and over into the Paps Mountain Range on the east. And then the green area around the outside is the transition zone. So I'll hand over to Mary now. And thank you so much for joining us, Mary. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if you're happy to start sharing yours.
Yeah, indeed. I'll just open up the presentation.
Perfect.
Good evening, all. Thank you, Eleanor, for describing the Kerry Biosphere Reserve. My name is Mary Sheehan. I'm one of the conservation rangers based in Killarney National Park, which is at the core of the biosphere. This evening, I'll be running through some of the natural habitats at the core of the biosphere. I'll be describing them in their importance in a European context, their location in an Irish context, the pressures and threats that they're faced with, and also how the buffer may help protect and conserve the core. So first, as Eleanor said, the core, the Killarney National Park, is based in the southwest of Ireland, where we have high rainfall, mild enough climate in the lowlands at least, and sometimes very high humidity. These are all factors in the types of habitats that we have. Now, I'm going to be using this red pointer just to point out different features as we go along the presentation. So here in the northeast is Killarney town. So the Killarney National Park is about 10,000 hectares in size, and it comprises of lakes, and not only the main lakes here, but also some bog lakes as well in the highlands. We also have lowland areas, the islands, Ross Island, the Muckross Peninsula and along the Long Range and the Upper Lake. We also have mountains such as Tomies, Purple, Torque and Mangerton. Another important consideration when discussing the habitats is the geology. So over here on the right hand side is another map of the National Park, and this time I've added a yellow Z, not too unlike Harry Potter's scar if you looked at him sideways. And to the north of that you have the limestone areas like Ross Island and the east part of the Muckross Peninsula. And then below that then you have the sandstone areas such as the highlands. And these all are important factors when describing the habitats. And I'll refer to this map over the course of the presentation. So just a little bit about the natural habitats and the Habitats Directive. So natural habitats, that means terrestrial or aquatic areas distinguished by geographical, abiotic and biotic features, whether entirely natural or semi-natural. I discussed there a moment ago the geographic factors and the abiotic ones, which include the geology and the soil type, and could also mean things like the rainfall and, say, in aquatic habitats, the water chemistry. The biotic features are things like bacteria, fungi, and anything that's living up to higher plants and communities of animals as well. The Habitats Directive is European legislation that takes into the maintenance of biodiversity, taking in economic, social, cultural, and regional requirements. The Habitats Directive ensures the conservation of a wide range of rare, threatened, and endemic animal and plant species. And there are some 200 of these rare and characteristic habitat types that are also targeted for conservation in their own right. And just to mention that in Killarney National Park, we have over 20 of these. So that's incredible, about 10% of all the habitat types that are described in the Habitats Directive you can find in Killarney National Park. An SSC, and this comes from the Habitats Directive, is an area where the where conservation measures are applied for the maintenance or the restoration of either or both natural habitats and the populations of the species for which the site is designated to, and to maintain these at a favourable conservation status. So Killarney National Park, if you wanted to look at it further, the code for it is 000356. It's an easy number to remember. The SPA is a designation under the EU Directive on the Conservation of Wild Birds. Under this, member states have a duty to safeguard the habitats of migratory birds and certain particularly threatened bird species. Together with SACs, the SPAs form a network of protected sites across the EU called Natura 2000 sites. So the next map is a map of Killarney National Park again, and this time I'm showing the mosaic of different types of Annex 1 type habitats. The name Annex 1 comes from, these are the annex of the Habitats Directive that lists out the different habitat types, while Annex 2 refers to the animal and plant species. So here in Killarney National Park, say for example, the different colours mean different habitats. So the orange there refers to the woodland, the old oak woodlands. So you have these in Tomies and Derryconney and so forth. And if you notice, they're south of that Z line, the fault line there on the sandstone. While here on the Muckers Peninsula in Reenadinna, we have the yew woodlands. In the uplands, we have a mosaic of blanket bog, wet heath, and a complex of these types. And these are represented by the blue, green, and red areas. And just to note that the magnolia pale yellow areas here that are on the Muckers side and also over Knockreer and along the Kerryway, these don't at the moment fit into Annex 1 definitions, but I'll talk a little bit later about these habitats. Overall, about 80% of the park has an Annex 1 habitat. So tonight I'll be grouping the habitat types into woodland, aquatic, heath, bogs, grasslands and rock. I'll also mention the plants and animals that are in the conservation are qualifying interests for the SAC in Killarney National Park. These are an aquatic plant called the slender naiad, the Killarney fern, pictured here with other filmy ferns, mollusks, and these include the kerry slug and the freshwater pearl mussel. The insect is the marsh fritillary. Fish species, there's 5 in total. We have salmon, Killarney shad, and then we have 3 types of lamprey species. These are types of jawless fish. And then we have birds, the Greenland white-fronted goose and the merlin, and the mammals are otter and lesser horseshoe bat. It's important, I suppose, to mention at this stage that I'll be describing tonight things in terms of a European context, but also there are many more plant and animal species protected under Irish legislation under the Wildlife Act. So I'm starting off with woodlands, and we have 3 types of woodland that are regarded as Annex 1 species. The first is the yew, and it occurs predominantly on shallow soils over limestone pavement and outcrops. And over on the left-hand side there, you see a yew tree on limestone. The second type is alluvian riparian forests, and these contain ash, alder, ash, and willow. These occur in heavy soils, which are periodically inundated by the annual rise of river or lake levels, but otherwise are well drained and aerated during low water. These first 2 habitats are also described as being priority habitats for the purposes of the Habitats Directive. And the third type then is old oak woodland. And in Killarney we have a very special subtype because we are in a high rainfall area. The subtype that occurs is rich in bryophytes, lichens and filmy ferns. We saw on the last slide some examples of the filmy ferns. And over here on the right-hand side is a microscopic image of a bryophyte and its beautiful structure. Bryophytes composed of mosses and liverworts. So for the purposes of just going through the distribution in an Irish context, I'll be using maps that came from a a National Parks and Wildlife document from 2019 called the Status of EU Protected Habitats and Species in Ireland. And I'll be using these maps as we go through the presentation. So firstly, if we look at yew, it has a very, very limited distribution in Ireland. There's only 7 sites, so we're very fortunate in Killarney to have yew woodlands. The second type, alluvial, has a more distributed range and distribution, and the old oak woodlands are similar. The pressures and threats that these type of habitats face include invasive and alien problematic species such as rhododendron, beech, sycamore, cherry laurel, traveller's joy, or old man's beard as it's called. It's a climber that climbs to the top of trees, blocks out the light, takes all the light, but also can get so heavy that it can break off limbs off trees and branches off trees and ash dieback. There's potential threats and pressures from overgrazing, deer and goats, and also the unauthorized removal of fungi, plant material and wood. Ways in which the buffer zone can assist is in the control of alien species and problematic species. Say, for example, if there is something like rhododendron in the buffer zone, and say if a certain section has been cleared, and if it's seeding, it could be wind dispersed back into the core, so it's important to control it as well in the buffer zone. Native woodland schemes. Another important consideration is the maintenance of structures to support animals. Say, for example, bats. Many bats use woodlands, so it's important to maintain man-made dwellings and bridges to support roosts for bats. And there's always an opportunity with education and research in this area. The next type of habitats are aquatic habitats, and these range from small bog lakes right up to, say, Loch Lane. So starting with small bog lake type, which is called acid oligotrophic lake habitats. These are in upland areas or in the sandstony areas. They're poor nutritional, or they're poor quality in terms of nutrition, but very high status in terms of water quality. And all these aquatic habitats need good quality status for water. These type of habitats support invertebrate populations, and here in the center I have a photograph of an emerald dragonfly. There are 2 types in Ireland, and both types occur in the national park. The northern emerald is the Killarney National Park is the only place where you'll find it in Ireland, and the downy emerald, which is pictured here, can also be found in Glengarriff and in Connemara. These are endangered dragonfly species, and they're important in an Irish context. Also, you'll find different types of plants that are adapted to conditions, poor nutrient conditions. Say, for example, here below I have a microscopic image of a bladderwort. This is a carnivorous plant that uses its bladders to suck in prey and digest them. Also, above here, we are moving on to another type of aquatic habitat. Again, it's oligotrophic, and the type it is depends on the type of plant species that occur there. And this is water lobelia. And this type of plant, it's submerged, the leaves are submerged, and they're in rosettes. And they use their root systems in order to get oxygen and carbon dioxide, and they don't use the water column at all. Moving on then, we're on Loch Lane, supporting, and this type of habitat has a little bit more nutrient in it. It's called mesotrophic. And here we have, say, populations of the Annex II protected slender naiad. And it also supports otters and fish species. Distribution of these habitats in Ireland, the acid oligotrophic lakes and the isothied lakes have a westerly aspect to them. The slender naiad type habitat is quite similar, but you also have locations in Cavan and Monaghan. There's another habitat called the vegetation of flowing water. this relates to rivers, and say for example the Galway River in Killarney National Park would be an example, and these are well distributed throughout Ireland. And finally we have a really interesting aquatic habitat in Killarney. It's a turlock habitat. This is normally associated, as you can see here from the map, with North Clare and East Galway and so forth, where these lakes are fed by groundwater as well as surface water, and there's a period where they completely dry out when the water table is reduced and there's no rainfall. So the pressures and threats to these types of habitats are over-enrichment leading to algal blooms, and these come from mixed source pollution. The accidental release of biocides, say for example sheep dip in an upstream catchment, the drainage and damage to peatland from an upstream catchment and releasing sediment, which would have consequences not only on the vegetation but also, say for example, the freshwater pearl mussel. There's pressures and threats as well from invasive and problematic species, for example the zebra mussel. So the rangers, we issue canoe licenses, and in order to do that we ensure that the person coming for the license has their canoe washed and dried and ready for inspection, so therefore minimizing the biosecurity risk. Also, when there's big events, say for example a big fishing event, we ensure that if there are any additional boats coming onto the lake catchment area, that these engines and the boats are cleaned before they're used in the catchment. Then how the buffer area may help is reducing and monitoring pollutants and pressures in the catchment areas, the local authorities' water programme, working with communities to maintain and improve the high quality water status that we need for these habitats. Also, we can share solutions, research and outcomes with projects like the Pearl Mussel Project and the McGillicuddy Reeks EIP. And there's opportunities there for education on biosecurity and sustainable tourism. The next type of habitats are heath habitats. And there's a variety of these in the national park. They range from wet to dry and also from lowland to upland. So say for example here on the left-hand top corner we have juniper scrub. This is a lowland one, and you can just see there the fresh juniper berries. These take about 1 to 2 years to develop into the more familiar kind of darker looking berries. These are coniferous plants, and you can come across these in Muckross and the lakes. Then we have wet and dry heaths, and these support a number of animal and plant species. So say for example the marsh fritillary butterfly, this is an Annex II species, and actually it's the only insect in Ireland that's protected under the Habitats Directive. Also there's bird species such as merlin and grouse, and grouse is hard enough to encounter and take a picture of, so what I have here are pictures of the grouse droppings. And then we have upland heath, and here we have the woolly fringe moss, which is an indicator species for these kind of alpine and subalpine heaths that occur at higher altitudes in the park. And finally, what I have over here on the right hand side is a picture taken earlier this year where there was a fire in a heath habitat. It was a mixed mosaic heath habitat here. And you can see the fire line where the fire officers worked overnight at extinguishing the fire. And many thanks to the fire service for lending their services to do this. And it caused, you can see here on the right hand side, some severe damage to the heath habitats. So the location in wet and dry heaths, they have a westerly distribution. The alpine, subalpine heaths occur mainly on higher altitudes, but then you see there's some there in South Galway, North Clare as well. And then the juniper scrub is interesting in that there's only 40 of these type of habitats, and in the south of Ireland they're few and far between. The pressures and threats include fire and burning, as you've seen there from the last slide. also erosion due to heavy usage by recreational activities. So say for example, up on the, if you're walking on the boardwalk on Torc, if you go off that, it leads to erosion. Invasive species are also a problem, and climate change could also be a future potential threat to wet alpine and subalpine heath. So where the buffer area can help is in the control of invasive alien species. And then again, once again, we can share solutions, research and outcomes with the McGillicuddy Weeks EIP, and raising awareness of the pressures and sustainable tourism. The next type of habitats that we have in Killarney National Park are often associated with the wet heath and dry heath habitats. These are bog habitats, and these occur mainly on the sandstony part of the national park. And blanket bogs are areas that are waterlogged for most of the year, and this allows the development of sphagnum moss and eventually builds up into being bogs. And it's a nutrient poor place, so plant species develop mechanisms to get additional nutrients. So say for example, we have sundews, and this is a narrowleaf sundew. And I know that Mary Toomey last week gave an excellent presentation on habitats in the McGillicuddy Weeks EIP, and she has different examples of sundews and butterworts, which is another species of carnivorous plant. She had a picture of the lovely blue, purple, great flowered butterwort, and this one here is a pale butterwort. It's much smaller, but still, it still is a carnivorous plant. Also, we have birds that use the bog, and I suppose the other type of habitat that's connected, it's a microhabitat of bog habitats. It's the beak sedge depressions. So this is an example. This is white beak sedge, and this was once a food plant for the green white-fronted goose. And these areas connect shallow areas around, say, sphagnum cushions to bog pools. So the distribution of these in an Irish context. So in the centre of Ireland, we mainly have what are called raised bogs. So you find the blanket bogs more to the west and also in the upland areas. And the beak sedge depressions are a microhabitat of bogs. The pressures and threats include fire and burning. And if you look over here to the right-hand side, I have another photograph, this time of a part that is blanket bog of that fire that took place, but later on in the summer, where you can see here, these white patches here are the sphagnum that were burnt. And what has happened here is that stronger, more competitive grasses and sedges have taken over where once there were sphagnum mosses and, say, carnivorous plants. So other pressures and threats include erosion, invasive species, climate change. Again, they're very similar to the heath, and similarly, what the buffer areas can do is similar to the heath habitats. So, grasslands in Killarney National Park. We have an interesting variety of different grasslands in the park, and I suppose they kind of turn your head a bit in terms of, you know, if you think of grasslands as being grass species, here you'll see, I suppose, there are different types of species besides grasses in these grasslands. So the first one is a very unusual type. It's called a calaminaring grassland, and it's a result of historic mining activities. But now it contains rare bryophytes and unusual locations for plants such as sea thrift and sea campion. Again, because of the mining activities, you've had a lot of mine spoil, as you can see here, and these would contain metals. So basically, other plants mightn't survive in these harsh conditions, and while sea thrift and sea pink can thrive in these conditions. Then we have other types of grasslands that are found close to lake edges, Millennia Meadows being one of these. And you find examples of this at Lord Brandon's Cottage and Ross Island. And these include species such as marsh marigold and also ragged robin, which is a lovely plant for pollinators. And finally, we have tall herb swamps at lake edges. You'll see this around the Muckrasabi shoreline, where you have tall plants such as wild angelica. You have purple loosestrife, and there's a close-up of it over here. And you also have meadowsweet. So the distribution of these in Ireland, the Killarney grassland has a very narrow range, because I guess due to the fact that these are dependent on mining sites. And I should point out, I suppose, that the Killarney grassland sites are in where the historic mining activities took place on Ross Island and on the Muckross Peninsula as well. The Millennia Meadows are more distributed and similar with the tall herb swamps. The pressures and threats, the Killarney, after time, there will be leaching of metals from the mine spoil, which leads to a decrease in soil toxicity. And this in turn will allow other plants to start to take hold, and succession, which is, so say for example, on the Muckross Peninsula, you have plants such as gorse and Scots pine taking over. Also recreational activities on the Ross Island, you have a lot of activities taking place there. So you have a lot of the plants being trampled around. Also with the Millennia Meadows and the tall herb swamp, you have things like the threat of potential invasive plants, for example, Himalayan or Indian balsam. So the buffer area can help with the control of invasive species, raising awareness of the pressures and threats, and sustainable tourism. And the final type of habitats that are described in Annex 1 of the Habitats Directive are rock habitats. These occur both in lowland areas and in higher altitudes. So the first one we have is silicious rocky slopes with chasmophytic vegetation. And put simply, this is basically like cliffs where there might be a crevice. And as we see here over on the right-hand side, this little crevice here has St. Patrick's cabbage, and a beautiful little plant that's allied to ferns is called fir club moss. And these grow in the crack and the cracks and the fissures. Also, we have silicious scree, which is accumulations of rock fragments. And I have two pictures of those. The first here has vegetation on it, and the second one then is more eroded, so therefore some of the vegetation is lost from it. And also, I suppose, just to mention that these are in high altitude areas in the national park, so they endure colder temperatures and snowfall and so forth. So, and also just to point out, in wetter flushes, you may come across some other little plants. These are like alpine plants, such as Dari saxifrage over here. Then on the Muckross Peninsula, on the lowlands, we have limestone pavement. I suppose one would traditionally associate limestone pavement with the Burren, for example. And I suppose this is mass limestone, and this is referred to as being a clint. And then you have a crack or fissure in it, and these are known as grikes. And then the first two habitat types occur in mountainous areas for the most part, while the limestone pavement, like I had said earlier, is more traditionally associated with, say, North Clare and South Galway and other areas up further north. So it's nice to have this type of habitat in Killarney. The pressures and threats include disturbance from recreational activities, grazing and succession, whether it's undergrazing or overgrazing, invasive species such as New Zealand willow herb at higher altitudes, and Catania on the limestone pavement. And you may have come across this in your walks. It's a plant species with little green leaves that kind of turn a nice red color and has red berries, which the birds love and help distribute. The Catania across the limestone pavement. So again, the buffer area can help with control of invasive species, and then Some of the habitats are similar to the Miguelicuddy Reeks EIP, so there's a potential there for the sharing solutions, research and outcomes. So now I want to move on to other types of, just one type of habitat really that is important in Killarney National Park. So these are the park and farmlands, and these support our rare breed Kerry herd and also our native red deer. And at the moment, we're working with third level institutions to do baseline studies in these areas with a view to research and development. And the outcomes would be increasing the biodiversity of these areas, looking at things like semi-natural grasslands or silvopasture to encourage pollinators, say for example, like this is small copper butterfly, and this is a grassland species of butterfly that's in decline. And looking at different methods, such as over on the right-hand side here, you have yellow rattle. It's also called the meadow maker. What it does is it parasitizes grasses. This suppresses the grasses and allows other broadleaf plants to flourish and therefore have a more diverse meadow. So it's in early stages yet, so watch the space. And finally, no presentation would be complete when discussing Killarney National Park without introducing a picture of a majestic red deer. And our native herd of red deer have been traced back to 4,000 years ago. And I suppose one of the purposes of the biosphere is to conserve biodiversity, but also genetic variation. So it's very important for this consideration as well. And then finally, I'm just one of the rangers and there's a team of us here. So I'd just like to introduce the rest of the team. So we have on the left-hand side, Tim, Padraig, Sean, myself and Will, and there's our manager, Danny O'Keefe. And then finally, just some websites for further information. So if you're planning a visit to Killarney National Park, a good site to check out is the Killarney National Park website, where it shows you routes you can take and also guidelines on leaving no trace, say for example, no foraging or specimen picking. The Notice Nature handle on social media is a good one for the latest updates regarding all things nature. And they have both a Twitter and a Facebook account. And another very, very useful site is the Biodiversity Ireland website. There's information there on the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, which has help and guidance for all sorts of, from playing pitches to gardens to tidy towns. There's a great resource of information there. Also, there's opportunities to participate in citizen science projects, such as butterfly monitoring, bee monitoring. At the moment, they have a dragonfly survey going right across the country. So the website there, there are the details. And also get involved in local groups. For example, the water catchment community. So the website there is the catchments.ie website, or the watersandcommunities.ie, get involved. And then I suppose if you have any questions, there's always the duty ranger number there below, and if you pick that up, you're bound to speak to one of these people here. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.